Nancy Guthrie. For years, she said very little publicly about the deepest corners of her pain. She smiled. She spoke. She wrote books. She appeared on stages. And the whole time, beneath every word, beneath every composed sentence, there was a secret. A truth she had been holding close to her chest for longer than anyone realized. People who knew her personally said there were moments, quiet moments, private moments, when you could see something shift behind her eyes. A flicker of something ancient and unresolved. Something she wasn't ready to say out loud. And then, one day, she spoke. What came out of Nancy Guthrie's mouth shocked the people who had followed her story for years. It reframed everything. It made people look back at her entire journey, the losses, the faith, the books, the tears, the silence, and see it all completely differently. Because here is the truth about Nancy Guthrie that most people never fully understood. Her story was never just about grief. It was about something far more complicated, far more human, far more raw. And what she finally revealed will shake you to your core. Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. Nancy Guthrie is not a Hollywood celebrity. She does not have a red carpet. She does not have a platinum record or a blockbuster film franchise attached to her name. But in the world she inhabits, the world of grief, of faith, of broken hearts searching for solid ground, Nancy Guthrie is one of the most recognized and deeply respected voices alive today. She is a best-selling author, a speaker, a Bible teacher, a woman who has sat across from thousands of grieving parents, grieving spouses, grieving souls, and told them something that most people are too afraid to say, that suffering is real, that God is still present, and that both of those things can somehow be true at the same time. She is the woman who lost not one child, but two. Let that land for a moment. 2 children, both born with a rare metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome, both given only weeks or months to live from the moment of their first breath. And Nancy Guthrie held both of them, loved both of them, and buried both of them. Most people, after a loss like that, disappear. They retreat into the kind of silence that never fully ends. They stop speaking publicly. They protect what little is left of their heart by never opening it to strangers again. Nancy Guthrie did the opposite. She wrote about it. She spoke about it. She built an entire ministry, hoping for something better around it. She co-founded GriefShare, a program that has helped millions of people across the globe navigate the darkest seasons of their lives. She became, in every sense of the word, a light in the darkness. But here is what made people stop and pay attention: when she finally opened up in ways she never had before. Because what Nancy Guthrie revealed was not just about her losses. It was about what happens inside a person when the grief never fully resolves, when the faith wavers in ways you never expected, when the woman who teaches others how to survive loss privately wrestles with her own unfinished pain. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie. The full story. The parts she kept hidden. The parts that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about grief, faith, and the human spirit. Nancy Guthrie grew up in a world that, from the outside, looked relatively stable and ordinary. She was raised in a home shaped by Christian faith, a foundation that would later become both her greatest anchor and, in the hardest seasons, the very thing she would wrestle with most deeply. But even in those early years, Nancy was someone who felt things deeply, who asked questions that other people seemed content to leave unasked, who looked at the world and wanted to understand not just the surface of things but the meaning underneath them. She pursued communication, moved through life with intelligence and curiosity, and eventually built a career and a life alongside her husband David. By the time she settled into life in Nashville, Tennessee, it looked from the outside like everything was unfolding exactly as it should, but few people knew what was quietly building beneath the surface. Because sometimes life does not announce its hardest chapters in advance. Sometimes the storm arrives without warning, without mercy, without any preparation at all. And for Nancy Guthrie, the storm arrived in the form of a baby girl named Hope. In 1999, Nancy and David Guthrie welcomed their daughter Hope into the world. And almost immediately, they received news that no parent should ever have to receive. Hope had Zellweger syndrome, a devastating, cruel, an incurable metabolic disorder that robs the body of the ability to function the way it was designed to. Babies born with Zellweger syndrome rarely survive beyond 6 months. Nancy held her daughter. She loved her. She prayed over her. And after 199 days to 199 days of loving and grieving at the exact same time, hope was gone. Most people would understand if Nancy had gone silent after that. Most people would have accepted it, expected it even. But what happened next changed everything. Nancy sat down and began to write. She processed her pain on paper in a way that was startlingly honest, not polished, not wrapped up neatly with theological answers, but raw and real and searching. The result was a book called Holding On to Hope, and it reached people in places that professional therapy sometimes cannot. It was not a book about having all the answers. It was a book about what it feels like to have no answers at all, and to keep walking forward anyway. That book opened doors. It brought Nancy onto stages, into churches, into conferences, into conversations with thousands of grieving people who had never heard someone speak about loss quite the way she did. And then, just 2 years later, their son Gabriel was born. And he too had Zellweger syndrome. The Guthries made a quiet, profound, and heartbreaking decision not to pursue another pregnancy that could result in a child born into the same suffering. Gabriel lived for 183 days, and then he too was gone. The rest of the world looked at Nancy Guthrie and saw a woman of extraordinary faith. A woman who had endured the unthinkable not once but twice, and had somehow remained standing. What they did not fully see was everything it cost her to remain standing. There were no scandals in the traditional sense attached to Nancy Guthrie's name. No public controversies. No explosive headlines, but there was something perhaps more privately devastating than any tabloid story. There was doubt, not the kind of doubt that makes for a tidy faith crisis narrative, with a clean resolution at the end. The kind of doubt that settles into your bones and lives there permanently, even when you are standing on a stage telling others about the goodness of God. The kind of doubt that does not cancel faith, but complicates it in ways that are almost impossible to explain to people who have not lived it. Nancy Guthrie has spoken carefully over the years about the tension she lived inside, about the moments when she stood before an audience and felt the weight of expectation, the expectation that she had processed her grief completely, that she was the expert, that she had arrived somewhere spiritually that her audience had not yet reached. But what few people knew was how much of her story she had still not said out loud. There were things she had held back, not out of dishonesty, but out of protection of herself, of her husband, of the fragile and sacred grief that belonged to both of them, and no one else. She admitted in more recent conversations that there were years when the grief came back in unexpected waves, when she thought she had moved through a particular layer of loss only to find it waiting for her again at a different depth, when the professional role of grief teacher and the private reality of ongoing grief experiencer began to feel like a painful contradiction. She did not know how to resolve. That tension, that hidden internal fracture, was something she had never fully addressed in public. Until now. Nancy and David Guthrie have spoken openly about the strain that grief places on a marriage. Statistics show that marriages often do not survive the loss of a child. The Guthries lost 2. And yet they remained together, grew together, built something together that became, in many ways, stronger than what it had been before the losses arrived. But Nancy has been honest about the fact that the journey was not simple or romantic. There were seasons when grief expressed itself differently in each of them. When David processed in ways that Nancy did not understand. When Nancy needed things that David did not know how to provide. When they were two grieving people living in the same house who sometimes felt profoundly, achingly alone. What held them together was not just faith, though faith was part of it. It was a daily, deliberate choice to stay, to communicate, to remain present even when presence felt painful. Nancy has spoken movingly about the way she still thinks about Hope and Gabriel, not as a distant memory, but as a continuing presence woven into the fabric of her everyday life. She has said that she does not experience grief as something that ends. She experiences it as something that changes, that evolves, that takes different shapes in different seasons of your life. And there is something in that honesty that has made her one of the most trusted voices in the grief space. Because she does not pretend. She does not perform a resolution she has not reached. She tells the truth about where she actually is, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it complicates the image people have built of her. As Nancy Guthrie has moved further into the second half of her life, something in her public presence has shifted in a way that is difficult to name but impossible to miss. There is a depth to her now that even her earliest readers can feel. A settledness that is not the same as having all the answers. More like having made a kind of peace with the reality of never having them. She has spoken about what it feels like to watch other people's children grow up, children who were born around the same time as Hope and Gabriel. About the strange and painful mathematics of grief, where you find yourself imagining who your children might have become, what they would look like now, what their voices would sound like, what they would laugh at, what they would care about. These are not thoughts that lead her into despair. But she has been honest that they are thoughts she still has, that they still arrive uninvited and sit quietly beside her. For a while before they leave again, she has reflected publicly on what it means to have built an entire identity around the loss. To have your name become synonymous with grief. To be the person that other people turn to in their darkest moments, even when you yourself are still navigating your own darkness. This moment, this season of deep and honest reflection, was what set the stage for what she finally said. When Nancy Guthrie finally spoke out in a more unguarded and vulnerable way than she ever had before. The thing that shocked people most was not what she said about her children. It was what she said about herself. She admitted something that had run quietly beneath the surface of her entire public journey, that for years she had struggled with a quiet but persistent fear that her grief had become her identity in a way that frightened her. That she worried in her most private moments that if she ever truly healed, if she ever reached a place where the grief no longer defined her daily experience, she would somehow lose her connection to Hope and Gabriel. That healing felt, at times, like a form of forgetting, and she had never said that out loud before. She also spoke about the moments when the faith she taught felt like a language. She was speaking fluently while simultaneously being unsure of its full meaning in her own life. She was not renouncing her faith. She was being honest about the profound complexity of holding belief and doubt in the same hands at the same time, for years without resolution. And she said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that she had spent so long being strong for other people, that she had not always given herself full permission to simply be broken. That revelation broke something open for thousands of people who had watched her from a distance and assumed that her composure meant she had somehow transcended the grief they themselves could not transcend. What Nancy Guthrie revealed was not a scandal. It was not a secret in any sensational sense. It was something far more powerful. It was the truth that the woman who taught the world about grief had never fully taught herself to receive grace for her own. Here is what Nancy Guthrie's story ultimately teaches us about being human. That strength and struggle are not opposites. That you can speak truthfully about something and still be in the middle of living it. That grief does not resolve on a schedule. And that the most honest thing any of us can ever do is stop pretending that it does. Nancy Guthrie lost 2 children. She built something beautiful from that loss. She helped millions of people. She wrote books and stood on stages and held the hands of strangers in their worst moments, and she did all of that while still being, underneath it all, a mother who missed her children. Not a grief expert. Not a best-selling author. Not a speaker or a teacher or a ministry founder. Just a mother, with an empty space in her life that no amount of purpose or meaning or faith has ever completely filled. There is something sacred about that kind of honesty. Something that cuts through all the noise of the world and reminds us that the most powerful thing any person can offer another human being is not a solution. It is the truth that you are still in the middle of it too. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. She is still speaking, still teaching, still showing up for grieving people in ways that cost her something real every single time. And perhaps that is the most Remarkable thing about her, not that she survived, but that she keeps choosing every single day to be present in the pain of others, even when her own pain has never fully gone quiet. That is not just strength. That is love. And love, as Nancy Guthrie's life reminds us, is always worth the cost.